Hello and welcome to Read. Today I'm going to talk about The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton. This is a book that was originally published in 1621 and there were several editions that were kind of released over the course of the author's life. The final edition, which is this one, the 6th edition, was released posthumously in 1651, and it's been a bucket list book for a little while. I've owned it and I got it because just kind of looking at it and getting an initial impression, I had this idea that it was going to be such a book for me, not necessarily because of the content, but because of just the fact that it existed and that this author thought, hey, I'm going to just kind of commit my life to writing this great big grand treatise on what melancholy is. And so I had it, but of course it's such a big daunting project, but I finally decided it was one of the books that I knew I wanted to read this year, and I committed 6 straight weeks to reading it and nothing else. I'm going to take the dust jacket off because it's going to take a little bit of time. This book got so beat up that I actually ended up needing to put some sticky tape along it because I was just carrying it with me essentially everywhere and just reading it like this great big tome on the train to and from work. But yeah, I finally did it. I finally made my way through, read The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton, and this video, in a way, so usually the format of the videos is that I talk about general things that I like and then I give some extracts from the book. This one I'm going to go through and actually talk quite a bit more detailed about it, because basically I really don't think a lot of people are actually going to read this book. I think that there are at least segments of it that you really should read, but pretty much the idea. So of course it's like Burton, so just in his kind of everyday life, we've actually got a nifty little introduction or a chronology talking about. So firstly, he was born on February the 8th, which is one of those hilarious things because I don't have any kind of belief in astrology or stars or anything like that, but as soon as I see someone who was born, you know, plus or minus 2 or 3 days from me, I'm like, knew it, Aquarius, exactly the same. Anyway, he goes and he studies at Oxford. He gets a Bachelor of Arts degree. He ends up getting ordained as a deacon, and finally in 1611 he gets ordained as a priest, and then basically just goes through and is kind of chilling out and writing The Anatomy of Melancholy, and he releases several editions over the years, as I mentioned. He is a lifelong bachelor, which is kind of funny because he almost uses that as his excuse to talk sort of detached in his sections where he's talking about love melancholy. But to give an idea of what you know, Anatomy of Melancholy is, it's broken up into a couple of sections. Firstly, we have Democritus Jr. to the reader, which Democritus Jr. is like this moniker that Robert Burton has adopted because he, and I think originally he didn't even publish the book under his name, Robert Burton. It was just Democritus Jr. And pretty much the idea of Democritus Jr. is that he says, everyone in the world is melancholy. Everyone in the world, everything's messed up, and here are just some examples of why it's messed up. And so there's about a 100-page rant where he's just talking about all of the discontents and all of the bad things that happen in the world, and I'll read some examples and extracts from it, but eventually he just kind of says, now that I've successfully proved that we are all messed up, let's get started. I'm going to talk about all of the cures. And so we have then after that a couple of partitions. There are some great tables of contents that I've got to show you. But yeah, pretty much he talks about a couple of, he'll talk about causes of melancholy, starting from the top, you know, like what's the main cause of melancholy? Well, what's the main thing that exists in the world? And it's God. So let's start with God as a cause of melancholy. And then we work down to angels, and then demons and witches, and then old age and everything like that. He gets in, and there are some sections in the middle that can be a bit of a drag because he's talking like about different types of foods and different filters and alchemical mixtures, which There's a particular charm that I really love of reading books of bad science or like wrong science. So just for some context as well, like melancholy or melancholia, the root or the origin of the word is black bile, because it's thought of as one of the four humors of the body, and I'll try and find like an image to get it up and display. But yeah, like this book came out or was written sort of 200 years, like not only before we started thinking of melancholy and depression as sort of symptoms and something that's happening in your brain, you know, like this is 200 years before they learned that germs existed. So it's very, it can be, like, you're not reading this for like the most up-to-date cutting-edge science. I still think it's really valid to read, because in the same way that like reading Fraser's The Golden Bow, you can be like, oh, you know, why do I care about the philosophies of all of these people who, you know, obviously we've kind of moved on. It's great as a sort of like a, what am I thinking of? What's the, like an appropriate, you're learning the language of the time, basically. And so if you want to, like, just as a hypothetical scenario, if you wanted to write a story set in the same time as Don Quixote or set in the same time as Shakespeare, you can't use the word germs. Like, you don't, because that wasn't part of the vocab. And so reading a book like this can kind of help you understand and see a language that's that was prevalent or that was known at the time. Can be a little bit hard when that book is over 1,000 pages, but, you know, fortunately Burton has such a great way of writing that is, like, he even makes this whole point in Democritus Jr. to the reader where he says, you know, I'm not trying to write in a fanciful way, I'm not trying to write in a very elegant or prosaic way, I just want my point to come across. And because of the time and because of how well educated he is, it's still so beautiful to read him write. But then there are also, like, you get the sense that this is really like the colloquial language of the time. And hopefully it will help people as well dispel any notions of, like, everyone in Shakespeare's time talked like how the people in Shakespeare plays talk about. It's just normal English, you know? Yeah, that's another thing, and I'm gonna hopefully talk about this as I get to the end and get to the extracts. But like I said, Burton was ordained as a priest. He uses a great, he has obviously, like, the whole book is, and the reason why it's worthwhile is that you're essentially getting great little essays and extracts of events and occurrences from biblical literature, from classic Latin myths and Latin epic poems. Like, Robert Burton can speak Latin, and it's hilarious. There are even some times in the book where he's so ashamed of the content that he's like writes it all in Latin, but then our kind of editor translator, I suppose, Angus Gowland, he thankfully provides some translations for us. And but yeah, it's like, in the same way that reading Anne Carson's Eros the Bittersweet is just this kind of great, like, weaving through certain Greek and Roman myths from the perspective of bittersweet love, you'll get just this whole range or survey of examples from not even just like myths, but also poetry and also real like occurred events and things from philosophy. He's always coming back to, you know, some of the greats of like Aristotle and Plato and going back further. But in the end, and at the end of the day, he is also, you know, a priest, and he is kind of having a religious groundwork. So a lot of the time he will say, you know, the reasoning or the way of kind of getting through certain feelings of melancholy is, again, reverting to a faith-based solution. And yeah, I'll talk more about that as I get to the end, but basically I would say that I kind of came around to that in the way that it can be a little bit annoying whenever you're, you know, when you're talking to someone in, I don't know, in just like a modern day, and they're just like ignoring your problems and just saying, oh, don't worry, Jesus will fix things for you. But yeah, I'll save that for when I get to it. Anyway, let's get started. I have a lot of extracts, but I've selected a couple. Oh, so firstly, actually, I'll just show you. This is the argument of the frontispiece and the frontispiece, which is just very beautiful all around. So that's quite nice. And then the great line. So one of the big things that Burton talks about and really stresses is that there are certain key things that can cause melancholy. And yes, even though like he's thinking of melancholy as black bile, the effects are still the same as what we would think of as someone who's sort of clinically depressed. And one of the big ones, of course, is he talks about not being idle and not kind of just stewing in inactivity, because that's one of the worst environments for trying to get over being melancholic. And he writes, "If any man accept against the matter or manner of treating of this my subject, and will demand a reason of it, I can allege more than one. I write of melancholy by being busy to avoid melancholy." And then elaborating on that a little bit further on, Burton was himself like melancholic all his life, and there's some examples in the chronology where he talks about going to an astrologer to try and cure him, and the astrologer basically does nothing. And so I think that's why he has some occasional digs at astrology throughout this book. But then he writes, "I learn from my own miseries to help those in distress," which is a kind of common theme, where that line is actually from Dido in Virgil, or in the Aeneid. But of course Burton has this great kind of weaving in and like blending quotes from classic literature as being that which he is himself, which again, it's so weird. I feel like this whole year has been just this great like line one after another of the correct next book to read. But right now I'm reading David Markson's This Is Not a Novel and other novels, which is literally exactly the same thing. But anyway, and then again, paying to what I said about him not putting his name on it, he says that, as Austen observes, not regarding what, but who will write, the celebrity of the author generates the craving, not valuing the metal, but the stamp that is upon it. They see the tankard, not what's in it. And so he then goes on to justify saying, like, all of these philosophers and all of these people will talk about, will have all of these morals, but they don't actually kind of practice what they preach, or talk about, they say like, oh, you don't need to be famous or anything, but they put their names on the books. And so Burton kind of challenged that and said, all right, Democritus Jr., I'm following in the tradition of Democritus, who I believe is this character here. And the story of Democritus is really quite beautiful, actually, and I can see why it had a strong impact on Burton. So I believe Democritus was the story was that he was in this courtyard and someone walked in and saw him, and he had 3 dead animals surrounding him, and those animals were he had dissected them, and he was looking at their guts and their bile, essentially, to find out why these animals were melancholy. And I can see why that image really resonated with Robert Burton, and it's this sort of idea of this having to have this grotesque method, but this really hands-on way of needing to kind of analyze and find out why people are melancholy. And he talks a little bit more about it, but to be honest, I kind of don't remember it that much, because it was sort of 1,000 pages ago where he was talking about Democritus. And this is another really beautiful line, which I'll talk about hopefully when we get to the end. But and as that great Captain Ziska would have a drum made of his skin when he was dead, because he thought the very noise of it would put his enemies to flight, I doubt not that these following lines, when they shall be recited or hereafter read, will drive away melancholy, though I be gone, as much as Ziska's drum could terrify his foes. And that's another great quality of this book. I just realized this video is going to be absurdly long, but that's another great quality of this book, is that so much of it is just the relationship that you, the reader, are developing with Democritus Jr., that there's just this great ending, this great conclusion to it. Another pattern, or another kind of quality that Burton says that can help melancholy is just of course, communicating and sharing problems. And he uses, I don't know exactly where, because there's a lot of footnotes in the book, and sometimes they can be about half of the page worth of footnotes, but one of the ones, like a lot of the time he's quoting famous authors in Latin, but sometimes it seems like he's just writing Latin phrases of his own, and this is one that seems to be his own, which is light cares speak out, heavy ones are stupefied. So just a kind of mantra to remember if someone's kind of being a little bit quiet, there's possibly a chance that they're holding on to something, you know, a lot more severe than they feel comfortable talking out about. This is still within Democritus Jr. To the reader, where he's talking about how bad civilization is. And he says, because Burton is a man of the people, and he says, a poor sheep stealer is hanged for stealing of victuals, compelled peradventure by necessity of that intolerable cold, hunger, and thirst to save himself from starving. But a great man in office may securely rob whole provinces, undo thousands, pill and poll, oppress at will, flay, grind, tyrannize, enrich himself by spoils of the commons, be uncontrollable in his actions, and after all be recompensed with turgent titles, honoured for his good service, and no man dare find a fault or mutter at it. And he writes, we are torn in pieces by our passions, as so many wild horses, one in disposition, another in habit, one is melancholy, another mad, and which of us all seeks for help, doth acknowledge his error, or knows he is sick. As that stupid fellow put out the candle, because the biting fleas should not find him, he shrouds himself in an unknown habit, borrowed titles, because nobody should discern him. Every man thinks with himself, I seem to be sane, I am well, I am wise, and laughs at others, and 'tis generally a fault amongst us all, that which our forefathers have approved, diet, apparel, opinions, humours, customs, manners, we deride and reject in our time as absurd. Thus, not acknowledging our own errors and imperfections, we securely deride others as if we alone were free, and spectators of the rest, accounting it an excellent thing, as indeed it is, best to enjoy the insanity of others, to make ourselves merry with other men's obliquities, when as he himself is more faulty than the rest. Changing the name, the stories about you. This is where he's talking about utopian societies as not really being possible, and he writes, utopian party is a kind of government to be wished for rather than effected, and then he lists a couple of societies, but of course, you know, mainly Plato's Academy or Plato's Republic as being a mere chimera. The community in many things. A community in many things is impious, absurd, and ridiculous. It takes away all splendor and magnificence. This was funny, and I wanted to mention it just because it came up recently. You shall find that of Aristotle true, there is no great genius without a share of madness. They have a worm as well as others. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because recently there was an Anne Carson interview where I feel like, I think it's this great interaction where the interviewer was like, but you said that madness lives next to creativity. And Anne Carson's like, I said that? Dang. And it's just the hilarious thing, but I think later on Carson says that, like Plato said it, which I think it's probably actually Aristotle. Oh, based on Burton's analysis. Alright, we are out of Democritus Jr. to the reader, and I just have to show you this table of contents here, because this is just a work of art in and of itself. Take a look at that. Anyway, we're jumping in. We've still got so many extracts to get through. The cool thing that he talks about is hydrophobia. He's talking about diseases of the mind, and hydrophobia is a kind of madness well known in every village, which comes by the biting of a mad dog, or the scratching, touching, or smelling alone, and is incident to many other creatures as well as men. So called because the parties affected cannot endure the sight of water or any liquor, supposing still they see a mad dog in it, which is kind of crazy. And then I realized that that's actually what happens when people get rabies. This is something I really liked, and he writes, for that which is but a flea biting to one causeth insufferable torment to another, and which one by his singular moderation and well-composed carriage can happily overcome, a second is no whit able to sustain, but upon every small occasion of misconceived abuse, injury, grief, disgrace, loss, cross, rumour, etc., if solitary or idle, yields so far to passion that his complexion is altered, his digestion hindered, his sleep gone, his spirits obscured, and his heart heavy, his hypochondries misaffected, wind, crudity, or on a sudden overtake him, and he himself overcome with melancholy. And he clues into this thing that David Foster Wallace brings up in Infinite Jest, which is just this idea of like of course, the effects on the outside might seem trivial to someone, but if they are causing very real consequences in a person, then the reasons are very real. Like whether you like it or not, if anybody reaches such a case of despair that they eventually lead to self-harm, then you might look at that and say that it's trivial, but it's not trivial if it led to a very real outcome. And I like this, that he talks again about the fact that it's not reasonable to be melancholy, but melancholy specifically overrides reason, and a quality of it is that it affects the imagination. Why doth not reason detect the fallacy, settle and persuade, if she be free? Avicenna therefore holds both corrupt to most whom Arabians subscribe. The same is maintained by a bunch of other people. To end the controversy, no man doubts of imagination, but that it is hurt and misaffected here. For the other, I determine with some people that it is first in imagination and afterwards in reason, if the disease be inveterate, or as it is more or less of continuance, but by accident, faith, opinion, discourse, ratiocination are all accidentally depraved by the default of imagination. And I love this. He's like, okay, we're going to talk about causes of melancholy, section 2, member 1, subsect 1, causes of melancholy, God. And then he says, general causes are either supernatural or natural. Supernatural are from God and his angels, or by God's permission from the devil and his ministers. That God himself is a cause for the punishment of sin and satisfaction of justice, many examples and testimonies of holy scriptures make evident to us. And then he just lists some examples from like Psalms and so on. Fun fact. All venison is melancholy and begets bad blood, a pleasant meat in great esteem with us, for we have more parks in England than there are in all Europe besides in our solemn feasts. 'Tis somewhat better hunted than otherwise, and well prepared by cookery, but generally bad and seldom to be used. So of course, this is the section where he's talking about different types of meats and diet. So he's talking about pork, red deer, hare, gonies, or conies, whatever that is. And then he talks about milk and different types of birds. Man, it's crazy. I love this. Oh, this is such a great one line. Carp is a fish of which I know not what to determine. What's so suspicious about carp? This is one of those lines that, again, there's a lot of lines from Horace and Ovid and great Latin playwrights, and I guess Horace was more of like a epigraphist or satirist, but something that, a line that I liked, which is again a good mantra for talking about, specifically this is talking about diet, and he says, Horace writes, sweet things turn themselves into bile, and the only exception that people seem to say is honey. And then in this section, this is where he's talking about idleness as being a cause, and he writes, opposite to exercise is idleness, the badge of gentry. So we're getting a similar Oscar Wilde picture of Dorian Gray stuff of just criticizing the gentry for being so inactive. Or want of exercise, the bane of body and mind, the nurse of naughtiness, stepmother of discipline, the chief author of all mischief, one of the 7 deadly sins, and a sole cause of this and many other maladies, the devil's cushion, his pillow and chief reposal. For the mind can never rest, but still meditates on one thing or other, except it be occupied about some honest business of his own accord, it rusheth into melancholy. As too much and too violent exercise offends on the one side, so doth an idle life or on the other. It fills the body full of phlegm, gross humours, and all manner of obstructions, rheums, catarrhs, etc. An idle person knows not when he is well, what he would have, or whither he would go. He is tired out of everything, displeased with all, weary of his life, neither at home nor abroad. He wanders and lives besides himself. In a word, what the mischievous effects of laziness and idleness are, I do not find anywhere more accurately expressed than in the verses, and he has this kind of like great long poem. Talks about sleep paralysis, or in the section of the force of imagination. This we see verified in sleepers by reason of humours and concourse of vapours troubling the fantasy, imagine many times absurd and prodigious things, and in such as are troubled with incubus or witch-ridden, if they lie on their backs, they suppose an old woman rides and sits so hard upon them that they are almost stifled for want of breath, when there is nothing offends but a concourse of bad humours which trouble the fantasy. And I don't know if anyone else has had it, but I've had some experiences of sleep paralysis before, and it's always pretty interesting. And then maybe talking himself up. He's talking in the section about study as being a cause, and specifically he's talking about wanting to kind of secure your legacy by like writing and creating stuff. And then he has this great line from Horace, which is, "Many brave men lived before Agamemnon, but all are buried, unlamented and unknown, in long night, as they lacked a sacred poet." So I can't really pronounce the name of this person who he quotes it, but he's talking about how, of course, when you're trying to study and you're trying to make cool things, you need to have finances to be able to be successful. And he writes, he says this quote, "Though indeed you may be Orpheus, softening rock with the sound of the lyre, you will accomplish nothing unless you soften their leaden hearts with gold or silver." And again, talking about poverty and want of finances as a cause, he has this great line, "By my genius I could have flown through the citadels of heaven. As my feathers lift me, so my heavy burden sinks me." Okay, I don't have anything particularly to say about this section, but this is section 4, member 1, subsection 1, and it is just called Prognostics of Melancholy, which is an awesome prog rock band name. This is cool because there's actually a reference to Don Quixote in here. And so I don't know at what stage that reference came in, but Don Quixote was written, I think, in 1611, and then The Anatomy of Melancholy, the first edition, came out in 1621. So, of course it needed to be translated. But yeah, just thinking about the fact that the Don Quixote was so popular that even within a decade, like Burton potentially had already read the book and then had like integrated it into his work. And another key that Burton talks about is sort of talking about this progression of melancholy. So of course, like, it gets worse over time, and it's totally okay to acknowledge that you're in the beginning stages and you're feeling it, but it is your responsibility to notice that and to try your hardest to withstand the beginnings. He writes, he himself must do his utmost to endeavour to resist and withstand the beginnings. Give not water passage, no, not a little. If they open a little, they will make a greater breach at length. And this is another great description of idleness as being a particularly bad cause. If it be idleness have caused this infirmity, or if he perceive himself given to solitariness, to walk alone, and please his mind with fond imaginations, let him by all means avoid it. 'Tis a bosom enemy, this delightsome melancholy, a friend in show, but a secret devil, a sweet poison. It will in the end be his undoing. Let him go presently, task or set himself a work, get some good company. If he proceed, as a gnat flies about a candle, so long, till at length he burn his body, so in the end he will undo himself. If it be any harsh object, ill company, let him presently go from it. If by his own default, through ill diet, bad air, want of exercise, etc., let him now begin to reform himself. And then elaborating a little bit further on, he essentially just makes the point that some people can be so far along that they can't even make the good judgment themselves to start to make those steps. So sometimes it does require external intervention. Like, you need to say to a person, like, the path that you're on is only inevitably going to lead to worse melancholy. Like, you need to let me help you. And again, that gets into a little bit of the kind of submitting to a religious or a higher power. But of course, it could also just be you as a friend noticing that somebody is melancholy. And in that same vein, we basically get permission from Burton to tell lies to people so that we can kind of help them out. Sometimes, again, by some feigned lie, strange news, witty device, artificial invention, it is not amiss to deceive them. As they hate those, saith Alexander, that neglect or deride, so they will give ear to such as will soothe them up. If they say they have swallowed frogs or a snake, by all means grant it, and tell them you can easily cure it. 'Tis an ordinary thing. And this is maybe a mantra that can help if you're in a stage where you're feeling like your burdens are quite heavy, which, of course they are heavy, but just an example from Socrates. He says, if all the men in the world should come together and bring their grievances together of body, mind, fortune, sores, ulcers, madness, epilepsies, agues, and all the common calamities of beggary, want, servitude, imprisonment, and lay them on a heap to be equally divided, wouldst thou share alike and take thy portion, or be as thou art? Without question, thou wouldst be as thou art. In this section talking about remedies against discontents, he's just talking about how important fortune and just dumb luck can be in being successful or in, flourishing in life. And he writes, "It is not honesty, learning, worth, wisdom that prefers men. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. But as the wise man said, chance, and sometimes a ridiculous chance, an accident, and most often a laughable one, has elevated many." This is such a cool line again from Horace that I love so much, but he says, "If a man is worthy of praise, the muse does not let him die." I love this as well. This is such a great, because one of the cool things about reading books pre-technology is that you have this chance of them like coming across sections where they're talking about, oh, this is an automobile or something, and you just have them explaining in very fascinated ways, very banal things. And he has that in this section. "The Turks have a drink called coffee, for they use no wine, so named of berry, as black as soot, and as bitter, like that black drink which was in use among the Lacedaemonians, and perhaps the same, which they sip still of, and sup as warm as they can suffer. They spend much time in those coffee houses, which are somewhat like our alehouses or taverns, and there they sit chatting and drinking, and drive away the time, and be merry together, because they find by experience that kind of drink so used helpeth digestion and procureth alacrity. Some of them take opium to this purpose." Alright, we are now heading into the third partition where he's talking mostly about love melancholy, which is a really great section. And yeah, he's doing just like this big survey of all stuff that has happened. This is in the section where he has had to talk about he has had to talk in Latin because of the content, and he is writing that he's talking about people having sex with animals, and then he writes, "They do this not only with wild beasts, but even with other men, which is the sin commonly called sodomy, and this vice was once frequent among Orientals, and doubtless among Greeks, Italians, Africans, and Asiatics." And I'm just like, well, Burton, it sounds like you're the only one who's not having a good time. An interesting thing that he talks about is how one of the things that causes excessive lust and lasciviousness is not necessarily that like we're showing off too much skin, but actually that it's the reverse, where he talks about this a person who went to Brazil and found both men and women naked as they were born, without any covering, so much as of their privities, and could not be persuaded by our Frenchmen that lived a year with them to wear any. Many will think that our so long commerce with naked women must needs be a great provocation of lust, but he concludes otherwise, that their nakedness did much less entice them to lasciviousness than our women's clothes. And then another great line, kind of working off the sentence or the sentiment of being idle. He said, "Minerva, Diana, Vesta, and the 9 muses were not enamored at all, because they were never idle." Jason Pratensis subscribes to this counsel of the poet, for ejaculation either immediately removes or mitigates the sickness. So we're talking about post-nut clarity, of course, and I would love to hunt down and try and find the first historical example of talking about no nut clarity. And another line that I said, so he goes on and he talks, of course, he's talking about like the relationship between men and women, and sometimes talking about the what being in a relationship with a less great woman can be. And then at the end he says, "And that which I have said, to speak the truth, no more concerns them than men, though women be more frequently named in this tract. To apologize once for all, I am neither partial against them, or therefore bitter. What is said of the one, by changing the name, may most part be understood of the other." Quick anecdote. Good cause had Vulcan to do as he did, for she was no honester than she should be. For anyone who was critical of my using the word honester in the title of a video, I just want you to know that it is a dated but valid form of the word. He's talking about religious melancholy as a cause. Yet as so many whetstones to make other tools cut, but not cut themselves, though they be of no religion at all, they will make others most devout and superstitious, by promises and threats, compel, enforce from, and lead them by the nose, like so many bears in a line, when as their end is not to propagate the church, advance God's kingdom, seek his glory or common good, but to enrich themselves, to enlarge their territories, to domineer and compel them to stand in awe, to live in subjection to the see of Rome. For what otherwise care they? If the world wants to be deceived, let it be deceived. 'Tis fit it should do so. And basically Burton is just really critical of the Roman Catholic Church, it seems to be, and I believe he goes on this rant of calling the Pope the Antichrist, which is kind of wild, but yeah. And it's so crazy because there are some sections where, you know, Burton writes, "Nothing seizes hold of men so strongly as the defense of their belief about salvation, since all peoples are accustomed to sacrifice their bodies and souls for this, and to bind themselves as a group with the tightest cords of intimacy." And it's just like, you can be so prescient and see that that is just a thing or a way that people act, but then still constantly revert back to your own religious beliefs and ideas, and it can seem like it's hypocritical, and it maybe is, but again, like Burton talks about it, and you know, in this final section where I think that, you know, I'll probably leave off here reading extracts, but because essentially, because Burton, in the final section, Burton talks about despair and basically says that, you know, there are times where he makes this clear distinction of when he starts to talk really closely and really detailed about suicide. He says that, you know, anyone who's kind of driven to that point where they are going to commit suicide is not melancholy anymore. They've kind of developed on to this state of despair, which is, and in that part he says, you know, from there, like, we need something greater. We really, really need some greater, like, higher salvation in order to kind of bring us back from the edge. And, you know, of course, I think that in a way, David Foster Wallace, like, really explored how do you do that if you're an atheist. But the reason why I ended up coming around to Burton's, like, excessive or great sort of emphasis on religion is just that, you know, I feel like there's in like what he's criticizing, he's not trying to say, you know, like, oh, you need to just be part of my group because I'm part of this group, and that's you know, that's the best thing. Like, Burton's so focused on just trying to help people and like essentially using religion, I think, in like the best or the greatest light that I can imagine. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I don't know if I have much more to talk about the anatomy of melancholy. There is like so many extracts, and some of them are just for me, and some of them I just left out because otherwise this video is already insanely long. But I'm really glad that I've read it. If anyone else has read The Anatomy of Melancholy, let me know what your experience is like. If you would like, you know, write some comments and I'll just tell you sort of what sections I think are worth reading. So I would really say that the third partition, where he talks about love melancholy and religious melancholy, is really great and just completely worth reading. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for tolerating like 7,000 not book specific videos while I spent 6 weeks straight reading this. I hope you all enjoyed. I'm back in the game. I'm doing book reviews again. So yeah, I don't expect you to read Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, but I just want you to know that it was a really moving and really important read for me. And if you do ever read it, I think that despite the fact that it will be a arduous journey, it is really quite beautiful. And another just kind of elusive thing is that now that I've finished the book and I'm not carrying it on my back to work every day, I literally feel lighter because I'm not carrying like 2 kilograms worth of pages. So yeah, that was Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.